Ah, okay, here we go. Let's get things started around here. All right. Hi. Most of you know me probably if you're watching this, but my name's Ricky, and I have wanted to do a step a little bit outside of the traditional bounds of VTuber content, as it were. And I wanted to do something more akin to a book club or a book report stream instead of just a normal chat. So I've been picking up this book and going through it along with people in my Discord. If you actually look down there, if you're not already in there, you can find some links there if you want to join along or if this piques your interest. But this book, How to Do Nothing, has been living rent free in my brain for a couple of weeks. And it's also something that I feel might be, I guess, beneficial to a lot of different people, particularly coming as we see sort of the light at the end of the tunnel of COVID, as people's relationships to media have been changing. I know mine have definitely changed. And also my relationship to content and content production has changed. I thought that this was maybe something worth talking about and could lead to some interesting discussion. And so I figured, hey, I got a stream, I got a YouTube channel, I've got all that. So why not? Why not give it a shot? And in worst case, I had fun doing it. And that's kind of the point of the book. Spoilers. So let's get things started. Let's see, Blackboard, next slide. Ba-bum. Here's the book. Welcome to the absolutely, I think, the first section. It's important to get things out of the way. So, How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy by Jenny Odell has been on my brain for quite a while, like I said. And I really wanted to share that with people, mostly because I feel like it's particularly relevant to other content creators, and in particular has some interesting relevation to, I think, VTubers in particular, but we can talk about that later when we get to it. So what is this actually? This is a VTuber book club featuring a VTuber. It's me. Hi, I'm the VTuber. My goal for this is really to maybe read a chapter or two of the book a week and then hang out and talk about it afterwards. So I've been reading along in my Discord, like I said, and if you want, go ahead and join. You can read along. The basic structure is to lay out each week to read either a chapter or two. And then what I want to do is do weekly streams like this, have a chat, have a discussion, and then probably mirror that over to YouTube later as sort of a video essay format, going over the book, my own reactions to it, and then talking with people that I'm chatting with sort of in my community and other content creators about some of the ideas that are coming up and seeing how other people read into the book and the kinds of things that are jostled loose in their brains over it. I know a couple of things have sort of come together or coalesced in my brain that I really wasn't expecting, both from the book, but also things that have been happening around me and shifting my relationship to content and making me think about things in different ways. So, why did I pick this book? I mentioned it a couple times on stream and people seemed interested, but by and large, I had finished streaming one day and my glorious and wonderful partner, who may or may not actually be watching right now, and also may or may not be the reason I delayed the stream so that she could watch after she got off of work, came into my office after I finished streaming and dropped a knowledge bomb, as it were, on me. She opened up the first chapter, pointed to this one passage that we'll talk about later, and said, "Hey, Ricky, I think you should read this." And we had this discourse going on about sort of my own relationship and burnout relating to content and content creation, and there it was, kind of spelled out on the page, really how I was feeling in terms of metrics and content creation and monetization and the pressures that go along with it. And of course, I then went along and we went camping. I started reading the book next to the fire after we had made it. And I realized that this book was really hitting and saying a lot of things that had been on my mind and I had been struggling to articulate. So I thought, well, after we came out of the woods, well, I wanted to share that with people and see what their own perspectives might be, and hence how we got to this stream. So anyway, getting into the actual book, I think we need to talk about a couple of things first. And specifically, I think there's one criticism I have of the first chapter in the introduction, which is largely going to be what this stream is about. I feel like when Jenny Odell was sitting down and kind of touching on some of this stuff, a lot of things were taken for granted. And even though I could read it because I had the background and I think probably a pretty similar sort of, let's say, political orientation, I feel like this book tends to have a Marxist materialist perspective on the attention economy, which tends to be how I see things as well. I imagine if you didn't have that kind of background and hadn't done that reading, it might be a little bit tricky to get into that first chapter, and some of the dots that are being connected might not necessarily seem really intuitive. And so I feel like if we're really going to get into this, before we can even really talk about the book per se, we got to talk about capitalism. And this is something that I talk a lot about on my stream, but I don't think I've ever really talked about directly. So let's get started here. Blackboard, what's a definition of capitalism? All right, deep breath. Capitalism is an economic system based on the private ownership of the means of production, that's very important, and their operation for profit. The central characteristics of capitalism include capital accumulation, competitive markets, a price system, private property, and the recognition of property rights, voluntary exchange, and wage labor. So there are three things I really want to point out here that are going to be very central to everything I'm going to talk about for, based on how I time this, probably the next about hour and a half. Wage labor. Wage labor, keep that in mind. The private ownership of the means of production, and voluntary exchange. So let's put this in context, right? Also, big shout outs to Wikipedia. So some people know this, but I'm a doctor in real life behind the VTuber. So even though as a professor, I would always tell my students not to ever cite Wikipedia, don't tell anyone that I just did. It's our little secret. No one has to know. Let's put this in context. What's an example of capitalism? This is the traditional, literally the textbook example of capitalism. Those with capital, and that is to say, in this case, let's just say resources. It can be political resources, it can be social resources, but in this case, capital, let's say AKA you own a factory, are going to pay laborers to use tools or the means of production that they own to produce goods. The laborer receives a wage. That's the sort of agreed on exchange, the voluntary exchange. The laborer comes up and says, hey, I see you have a lot of raw ore, you have these furnaces to smelt that ore, but you don't seem to either have the time or the skills to do it. But I do. And if you pay me X, I'll do that for you. That's the cornerstone of capitalism. And then the capitalist takes the product of that labor and then sells it for more than they paid the laborer and also the cost of the materials, and that difference is taken as profit. And that is, so in other words, as you may have heard before, profit is the stolen labor of the working class. So basically, the cornerstone of capitalism is that a person sells their time, aka their labor, to someone in order for to receive a wage, and then the person who has the ownership of the means of production makes more money off that exchange than they ultimately pay the laborer. And now, there's the classic examples that are the person owns a factory, but let's say, for example, let's look at this in a more modern context. Maybe you work as a researcher, and turns out that a lot of the software that you use as a researcher is very expensive. Getting access to participants is very expensive. And the company that maybe you're working for is willing to foot the bill for that to allow you to actually do the research so that you can actually do your job. And you are producing value for them, and that is in excess of what you're being paid. Yeah, sciences, you're absolutely correct. So I might be a little bit less chatty today as I go through this, but yeah, as someone who's used MATLAB, I am very aware of how expensive MATLAB toolboxes can be. At about $1,000 to $2,000 each, and it's or even if you look at an SPSS or a SAS license and what that costs over the course of a year, ooh baby, it adds up real quick. Or even if you work as, let's say, a freelancer, you work somewhere, let's say a freelance translator, you get a contract, or you're a freelance voice actor, you get a contract, you do your labor, working for a company, and then your work produces value for them. Either they can then sell the translated product, or you add a voice or some kind of value to the project, and they pay you an agreed on wage, but they ultimately are going to make more than that. So this is the basic idea, right? This is the underpinning of capitalism. But it's a VTuber lecture. So let's make it VTubers. Let's use the classic VTuber example. So let's say you're in Minecraft. Minecraft, notable game and also cornerstone of VTuber culture. One VTuber has the materials. They have the raw ore and they have the coal to make iron, right? But they don't have the time. They're like, oh, woe is me. I am a world famous VTuber. I have so many collaborations and I have to record these cover songs and I have to be active in my Discords and I have to be tweeting all the time. I do not have the time to smelt all this raw ore into bars. And so you come up as a eager indie VTuber ready to network and you say, you know what I have? I have nothing but time. And so you say, if you pay me an X number of diamonds, I will sit and I will smelt all that ore and I will make those bars for you. And so you have now agreed to a wage. And now the world famous super popular VTuber pays you your diamonds, but then you find out that they took those iron bars and they sold those for way more diamonds than they ever paid you. You created value through your labor, and that value was in part paid to you and in part went to the person who collected the materials. And then, since it's Minecraft and you're a VTuber, you burn the factory down. But that doesn't always work in real life. So that's kind of like when I talk about capitalism, that's what we're really thinking about in sort of in an abstract sense. And that's going to be an important thing to get out of the way in talking about the book and the attention economy later on. So the biggest thing that we're going to talk here and getting into the book is that under capitalism, the most important asset is time. It's not the ore, it's not the means of production, it's time. And time is what laborers have, and they're looking to sell it. I have time, and also presumably skills, but I can do this, and I have the time to do it. And the capitalist is looking to buy that time, to pay them a wage for the time that they spent. And time is, in its sense, the cornerstone of the whole system, and time is inherently valuable. And, as Lex Luthor would say in Superman 3, it's the one thing they're not making any more of. There's only 24 hours in the day, everyone has a limited amount of time. Hence, it is a scarce resource at all. Now, there's a long history around time. Because if you think about this, you now have attention, right, built into the system. You have the laborer who wants to sell their time to get you into in order to make money. And they want to sell it for the highest value that they can get. And the capitalist who owns the means of production wants to sell it to wants to buy that time, buy that labor at the lowest cost possible. There's a fundamental tension built into the system. And given the way that capitalism operates, if time is valuable, well then what's to stop somebody from working 8, 9, 10, 12, 14, 18, 16, 20 hours a day? Really not a lot. Until the 1880s, when the combined labor market brought up the 8-hour workday campaign, which set out to say that there should be 3 hours for work, 6 hours for rest, and 15 hours for, oh, this is the wrong one. Oops. Forget it. Next one. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will. This was a very popular slogan, and I want to say 1881. So the history of this point is that the combined labor unions, it's like forming what they call the International, and then later on the Second International, formed together and gave an ultimatum to the owners of the means of production. That we needed limits and boundaries around time, guidance and guidelines about the ways that we are going to spend our time for you. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. Now, when Jenny Odell, the author of How to Do Nothing, talks about this in the book, there's a particular point that she brings up that I think is very, very important. 8 hours for what we will doesn't necessarily mean leisure. It's not about, hey, we need time for vacations or time to go VTube outside of our normal jobs. What we're talking about here is the demarcation of time and looking for structure to be imposed on this capitalist system where we have that inherent tension where the laborer is incentivized to sell every waking possible hour. It's like, but instead, unions got together, banded to get an 8-hour workday, a social safety net, and in doing so, drastically improve their quality of life. And we now remember that date of an ultimatum as May 1st, aka May Day. So you may have heard that phrase before. It is a very storied history in labor movements. And this is a very, very brief history. Now, what's interesting as well is that even now, and I want to talk about this later, that the 40-hour work week, as the science has just brought up in the chat, the 40-hour work week was ultimately a compromise. And it's like, in other words, that this was actually not necessarily an optimal point. This was sort of a point that was reached between laborers and the owners of the means of production. This was the compromise. And keep that in mind when we talk more, and even especially on this next slide. Because now back in the 1880s, there was a strong organized labor movement, particularly in the United States. And then things happened. So around the late 1970s, going in from Nixon to the Bushes, to the Reagans, to the Clintons, it's like what we saw is a marked shift with the decline of the strength of organized labor, the transition to the late stage neoliberal capitalism. And what we see there is that even though with technological advances like computers for accelerated posting, energy drinks for more optimal posting, what we see is that there is a dramatic increase in worker productivity. And yet wages have remained stagnant. Not even that they have increased at a lower rate, they just haven't stopped. They haven't risen at all. And so as we saw union busting take hold, there was a decline in the strength of organized labor. It's like, particularly if you wanted to, there's a whole lecture to be given on Reaganomics and the busting of unions and federal unions. But this is an important distinction here to talk about. Look at this. This is so dramatic. It's not even like they just kind of shifted. It became a flat line. And there are broad-reaching systemic consequences for this. And so we really want to think about and put an earmark on here. Let's talk, remember, the late 80s, the late 70s into the 80s. And even when we think about this, I'm looking at this now on the x-axis, this cuts off at about 2010. We've had 10 more years of this since then. And you know what? It only gets steeper, baby. We're all along for the ride, whether we want it or not. So what are the consequences of this right now? With the decline of organized labor and this decoupling of real wages and productivity. Let's talk about hustle culture. Let's talk about the hustle. So stagnant wages and other factors like the rise of an alienation via technology have birthed what we call the hustle. Now there's one ad that Jenny Odell brings up in the intro that is only described, but I knew immediately and vividly because I remember feeling sick to my stomach when I saw it in a bus stop once. This ad for Fiverr. So what is Fiverr? Fiverr is a microtasking website, or Build is a microtasking website, where, at least on launch, a person could spend $5 to maybe pay someone to edit an essay, compose a song, do what have you, like these sort of very small tasks that are sort of atomized and broken out, so that if a person has free time, they can go to Fiverr and accept $5 to do some kind of short task for a person. And so what does this ad really break down to? You eat a coffee for lunch. You follow through on your follow through. Sleep deprivation is your drug of choice. You might be a doer. And so what do we end up with? This is a really great quote here. Judging again from the book itself, I see a similar battle playing out for our time. A colonization of the self by ideas of productivity and efficiency. One might say the parks and the libraries of our self are always about to be turned into condos. And after the future, the Marxist theorist Franco Bifo Bernardi ties the defeat of labor movements in the 80s to the rise of the idea that we should all be entrepreneurs. So we talked about the tensions of capitalism, right? And like the laborer versus the owner of the means of production. But with the defeat of organized labor, this is really where we're left. When you couple that with stagnant wages, a rising cost of living, all of a sudden, your job isn't enough anymore. Those boundaries that were fought for so hard in the 1880s start to break down. And with supplanting those virtues of organized labor and healthy boundaries around work, and remember, the 40-hour work week was a compromise. What we see instead is the colonization of our selfhood with capitalist ideas of productivity, efficiency, constant expansion. And that's how we get hustle culture. You can always be working. Everything can be profitable. Everything can be work. So when we think back to that 8-8-8 split, remember 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and importantly, 8 hours for what we will. That doesn't quite hold up when working 8 hours a day or 40 hours a week isn't enough for you to live. And there are very, very few points where this is actually relevant, where this is relevant. Very few cities in this country where the average or median income for a full-time job, 40 hours a week, is enough to make rent. And so, hustle culture emerges to sort of celebrate this idea of having constant work. Everything can be work. You can always be working. Everything can be profitable. No matter what you're doing, you can find a way to make it into a business. That's a good question. I'm going to have to earmark that for later. It's also one that I'm not sure if I can really answer. So are we now seeing where sort of, I guess, white racial hegemony is breaking down under capitalism? That's a very interesting thing. I'm going to have to think about that more actually before I give an actual answer. I don't want to shoot from the hip on that one. So anyway, hustle culture celebrates constant work. So think about this, and particularly when we're thinking about hustle culture, and yeah, I do agree it's a very worthwhile question. Hustle culture means that everything can be work. You're playing video games, you're good at video games, have you considered streaming on Twitch? You can monetize that. You're really good at art? Have you considered taking commissions? Wait, you're really good at audio too? Have you considered taking work in either video or audio editing? You can do it in your free time. It's great. You can make money in your spare time. In fact, actually, when I was going through and looking on YouTube to get that intro music I had playing for the start of the stream, I got hit by an ad for Uber. And it was all built around about how the idea of like, oh, Uber is so flexible. Driving for Uber means I can do it whenever I want. And that's so important to me. But the backtext there, or the subtext, is that you can always be working if you're working for Uber. Every single moment of your day, you don't need to sleep, or you can sleep in your car. You can do what have you. That's really the text there. It's hustle culture. All of your time can be profitable. You can work your job and then drive Uber on the side. And it's billed in the ad as being this great thing. You're a doer. You're being virtuous under this system. And that's where we ultimately land up here with hustle culture. So why is that bad? Because I'm making this sound terrible, but if you could be a doer, what's wrong with being a doer? What's wrong with being a go-getter? Well, the first part is that hustle culture kills people. It's a very, I pulled these from a blog post. You can find the URL there. And I'm going to be posting my slides up later as well if you're interested in that. But hustle culture is not good for people. I can speak to a couple of things here anecdotally, but by and large, if you want to look at this idea, what is hustle culture being really rooted in? Hustle culture is rooted in financial precarity. At the idea that you have to always be looking for the next hustle, the next way to make money, because maybe your full-time job or even your 2 jobs is not enough to make ends meet. And so you have to find ways to monetize your off hours. That's the essence of a hustle. And it turns out that living in that kind of precarity is not good for people. And in fact, we start seeing more instances of heart disease, obesity, anxiety, depression, all these horrible things that can be rooted and traced back to that same point. In that graph, we can look at the correlation between stagnant wages, increasing financial precarity, and all types of physical and mental health impairments that ultimately shorten people's lifespans. Now, I can tell you anecdotally, I am a trans woman, which means that I have to do routine blood work. And so I can see where all my hormones are, and it makes a really cool chart over time. And so I hit a point in my graduate education where I hit a spot where my situation became fairly precarious, and I wasn't really sure what was going to happen to me in the far future. Now, 2 things that you can think about here. There are 2 important hormones, cortisol and testosterone. In response to stress, and particularly sort of precarity and looming stress, our bodies produce these and produce a lot of them. If you've ever wondered why people lose their hair from stress, it's because the long-term consistent stress causes the body to elevate its production of testosterone, which will cause people to lose their hair. Which I did again. Even though I was taking testosterone blockers, when I started doing blood work again, I could see in my hormone panel how my body was responding to the stress that I was under because of my precarious situation with employment. All of a sudden, I could see, my testosterone was falling. And then even though I was on the highest dose that my endocrinologist would prescribe to me, my testosterone levels looked like I wasn't taking anything at all. They had gone to a pre-hormone hormone replacement therapy state. Not good for people, especially in the long term. And yet, that's the situation that we find ourselves in. Also, it's not productive. Science has brought this up in the chat earlier, but again, the 40-hour work week is a compromise, and more research is coming out that is saying, hey, you know what? Actually, people are more productive with a 30 or 32-hour workday. It avoids burnout, it increases productivity. All in all, that's really what we maybe should be doing if we're trying to really optimize productivity, which doesn't really coincide with the idea of hustle culture, right? That you can always be working, that you should always be working. In fact, all the data says that if you try to exercise this, your work ends up being kind of crappy. It degrades over time. Again, in grad school, there were stretches where I was working 50, 60, 70 hours a week. And then I would work a 14-hour day and I would come back the next morning and I would realize that the work I had done was of really poor quality. After a certain point, after, the 10th something hour of writing, I was writing incomplete sentences. I was making really simple grammatical errors. It sucked. And my productivity actually increased when I started getting a better handle and setting better boundaries around my work-life balance. And also, it's the third point here, as pointed out on this blog, most of the people that are pushing for hustle culture aren't the ones doing the actual work. And so you're looking for this, and here you are, and it's like, here you are being told, you gotta work, you gotta grind, you gotta do all this. You know what? The person telling you to grind probably isn't grinding themselves. Here's a nifty quote. There are easier places to work, but nobody ever changed the world on 40 hours a week. I'll give you a minute. Who do you think said this? Do, 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 do. Do, 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 do. Elon Musk. Right? I mean, of course it was Elon Musk. So I want to break this down here for a second. Elon Musk is a lot of things, but I want to really specifically point out that where did he really get his wealth to start off of? It was on the back of his father's colonial South African emerald mine. Coincidentally, after fleeing South Africa after the fall of apartheid, his family has never returned. I wonder why. It's such a mystery. Also, he apparently thinks he's the Green Lantern because there's more injuries in Tesla factories than on average because he removed all the standardized yellow safety signs because he doesn't like the color yellow. How cool is that? This is the guy who's telling you need to work. This is the guy who's telling you that you need to work harder. The guy who took safety signs out of his factories, and never mind, don't even need to get into the death trap tunnel for Teslas that has no emergency, the death trap tunnel where there's no escape way to get in, and especially Teslas, which have a notorious problem where their batteries sometimes just explode. Love to be trapped in an underground tunnel with no safety lane, no way to get out, and in a car that may or may not just explode. But hey, that's the guy I would trust to talk to me about my labor and the value of it, right? Don't worry though, it's gonna get worse. Let's talk about the attention economy. We're getting closer to the actual subject of the book now. So it always gets worse. So what is the attention economy, right? When we're talking about time in capitalism, right? That time is important. You can really extrapolate that, and you can find the close cousin of time, attention. So if time is itself valuable, and part of that value is in its scarcity, attention is also scarce. We only have so much time, and we can only attend to so many things at once. And correspondingly, there is a whole world set up out there around attention economics. Attention is now a commodity to be bought and sold. And this might seem strange, and this might seem new and foreign, but let me introduce you to AIDA. Attention, interest, desire, and action. This is actually a classic marketing model. It posits that if we're talking about trying to sell something to someone, or getting someone to do something, the first step is awareness, or in this case, supplanted with attention. And so, where do you end up here? You gotta get, if you want to sell someone to something, or sell something to someone, or get them to do something, you want them to engage with your product, see your movie, do what have you, you gotta be able to get their attention first. Marketers understand this. They've written books on this. There's a whole economy built around this. And in fact, you're participating in it all the time. You ever think about advertisements? You ever think about how when you go on YouTube, you might see a tailored ad? Those tailored ads are specifically based on data that has been extracted from your browsing habits to get you to attend to things. It's like when I go on and when I tweet about how much I love my girlfriend, and then I go to YouTube and they're serving me ads for marriages, like for either wedding rings or ceremonies or different wedding venues in my area. All this is set up. They don't want to serve me random ads. The first step of this model is to get my attention. And basically, all they're trying to do is get me to click on that, and they know the first step is to get me to look at it. And a lot of the internet is supported by an advertising bubble. If you think about this, you're going to see, you think about Google, you think about YouTube, a lot of their value and their estimated value is based on their ability to sell and deliver advertisements to you. Think even about Twitch, where I'm streaming this right now, or YouTube, where I'll probably put this up later and maybe you're watching it. What you're seeing here is the entire, it's sort of a element of an ad bubble where a lot of the valuation, the money that is coming to pay people for streaming on Twitch or to pay, is based on their ability to attract attention and deliver advertisements to viewers. And so how does this come together? And it's like, when you think about things like YouTube, Instagram, the intersection of the attention economy and hustle culture, we end up with influencers, right? People whose whole purpose is the ability to attract your attention and sell you a product. How many times have you clicked on a banger tweet and then someone tries to sell you a vibrator 3 replies down? Sorry, I'm catching up with the chat for a little bit here. Yeah, the the Glengarry, I almost put in the Glengarry Glen Ross point. Always be closing, always be closing. Put that coffee down, coffee's for closers. So, with the increasing lower barrier of entry, whereas maybe it was big ad agencies and that were in charge of advertising beforehand, the tools to engage and to be able to profit from the attention economy have been increasingly diversified and democratized. If you can make a YouTube channel and you can get views, you can make money on this. You can be a consumer. You can be both a consumer and a producer in the attention economy very easily. And I want to talk about specifically idols as well. Now, idols, and what separates an idol from a particularly just a celebrity, is their ability to be specifically tailored to function in the attention economy. They're not just very good at what they're doing, they're radiant, they're eye-catching, they're curated from top to bottom to get your attention to sell you a single, to get you to send super chats on their streams. And I got bad news for you, all VTubers are just idols, and that includes me. This is it. This is the Trojan horse now. But specifically, I know Red Muffler Man brought this up in the chat here, the idea of the personality economy, which I think, as Aaron brought up here as well, that's a subgroup of the attention economy. And it's something that has become increasingly brought about with idols and the birth of the sort of the idol phenomenon, which if you want to think way, way, way back when, to when we talked about the decoupling of wages and productivity, I'm saying like correlation doesn't always equal causation, but the golden age of idols in Japan was the 80s into the early 90s, when we also saw the shift to neoliberal economics. And I think that there's a connection to be made there about the decoupling with stagnant wages, the decoupling of productivity and wages, precarity, the emergence of the attention economy as we know it now, and the emergence of influencers and specifically idols that are designed to really play with and operate and excel in this environment. One of the terms that gets thrown around by scholars in this area is the affection economy, where it's not even just so much awareness or attention to interest to desire to action, but that specifically the idol operates by getting you to like them personally, creating a personal connection with the fan or consumer that then later on motivates their interest, their desire, and their action. Isn't that cool? Someone who has been perfectly cultivated to get your attention, to ultimately get you to like them personally, to develop a parasocial relationship, which can then be monetized later on down the line. I think somebody, some nerd, could probably make a really cool lecture about that. And you know what? If you really want, you might just know somebody who did. And if you're interested in that particularly, hit me up and I'll send you the link to it on YouTube. This is before my days as a VTuber, a friend asked me to specifically that question about sort of capitalism and VTubers. And I had a lot of fun doing this one as well. I guess this conversation is kind of a sister, a sister talk. I guess, yeah, that's a good term for it. It's pre-antler. The attention economy, VTubers and vibrators. Ah. Oh, that's really good. All right, so we're almost there. We're almost to the actual book, right? But I want to pull all this together really quickly. So, going back to the 1880s and the history of the labor movement, there has been a steady erosion of financial security and the victories that were won by the labor movement. And this then went into overdrive during the 1970s and the 1980s, where in a combination of globalism, the shift to neoliberal capitalism and financial instruments away from a productive economy to a service or financial economy, we started to see that there was a very successful war waged against organized labor, which resulted in later on this environment of precarity, where we have an entire generation with student loan debt, few material assets, and an impending climate crisis that has now also introduced this idea that has necessitated that people turn their hobbies into productive time, creating hustle culture. And all the while, we live in the proliferation of attention economics, which have only kicked up into super mega ultra overdrive, given the rise of social media. It's cool, right? We are now all, regardless of whether or not you choose to be, simultaneously creators, consumers, and commodities to be bought and sold. Our attention and our sense of self is atomized and tied to our ability to be productive. And even if you choose not to do this, you don't want to take a part, let me guess, you don't want to take part in this? You didn't consent to be part of this? I got bad news. You ever made a banger tweet? Well, that banger tweet was used to serve ads to people and increase Twitter's bottom line. You ever streamed before? You made Jeff Bezos more money. And it's like you are a creator in that case in the attention economy. And all the while, you're also consuming messages and all these attempts to shift or nudge your attention all the time. You basically can't use the internet without being served targeted ads. And your attention, whether or not you click those ads, have been researched, broken down, atomized, granularized, and commodified to be bought and sold on open marketplaces. It's great, right? I love it. So now we can finally talk about the book. So doing nothing. One of the pieces that I really thought was kind of cool that Jenny Odell brings up in the book is that there is a historical trend that coincides with the decline of labor unions and wages. And that's the decline of public space. There's fewer parks, there's fewer public spaces. We have seen sort of the brutal architecture to prevent people from being able to comfortably sleep on benches. And all that comes together to this idea that even the physical spaces that we exist in have been shifted and warped by this emergence, like by these shifts in the economy. The actual land and area that we inhabit has been changed to represent these shifts in our economic system and the way that we relate to each other. And so, correspondingly, that 888 split that we talked about before, where you had 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what you will, that doesn't work anymore. And now, what we've got is a lump 24-hour period where everything can be monetized, everything can be made into a form of productivity, and that's where we live. And that's how we exist. And this was a quote that really, really got me really deep. So this is from Franco Bernardi, who we talked about before. In the global digital network, labor is transformed into small parcels of nervous energy. The worker no longer exists. Their time exists. So think about, remember Fiverr, where you can go online and someone gives you a task. It's not really connected to any big project. And what you're really selling is your time. And that's the real commodity. You as a laborer don't matter. It's your time that is really valuable. Do you have 5 minutes? Do you have 2 hours to do a stream? How does this all work together? So as we've now shifted into this digital network, even the nature of our physical spaces has changed, and correspondingly our relationships to digital spaces have changed, and physical spaces have changed, but correspondingly labor has also transformed. And now what we have is these small atomized spurts of energy, of productivity that have been disconnected from the actual worker themselves. And that's where we are. What really exists is our time or our attention. And so every waking moment has become the potential to make your living. And even leisure is submitted for numerical evaluation. Because now that 8 hours for what you will doesn't really exist. That boundary that was so hard, that it was fought for back in the 1880s, isn't really around. Likes, faves, subscriptions, personal brands, your average viewers, your number of impressions, all of those come together to evaluate even our leisure. And so you might say, all right, well, I'm just gonna, stream as a hobby. And, I'm gonna just like play some games, stream to some friends. You're still gonna be bombarded with metrics. Metrics that are designed to make you think about growth, are gonna make you think about the ways that you can be evaluated. Are your tweets getting enough likes and faves? Are you getting the good dopamine from social media? Did you get more followers this stream from last time? Like from the last time, how does that compare to your average? What metrics are you hitting? Particularly talking about streaming on Twitch, there's a whole system of gamification. There's achievements. How many did you get the badge for streaming 4 days this week? All of this works. And just like, again, kind of trying to interact with chat here as well, like science is brought up here. Your new 40 view video on YouTube that is too small to be monetized for you is giving you nothing, but is making them money. And so all of these terms of growth and social media metrics speak again to that colonization of our selfhood. That virtue of constant expansion, of always being productive, has infiltrated what was considered to be leisure activities before. You like art? How many likes are you getting on Twitter? You like music? How many SoundCloud listens did you get? You think you're good at video games? Do people watch you? When time is the main asset here, time becomes too valuable to spend on nothing. Everything becomes atomized. Everything becomes a vehicle for profit. And now this is the part where I own myself here. In making this lecture, I was nervous. I was nervous that nobody was going to shut up, that no one was going to show up. Hazel, hey. Sorry, my dog's being a butt. Because if I'm sitting here and no one shows up, then all of a sudden, I'm sitting down, and have I wasted that time? Time that could have been spent on something else. Was that time wasted? And then I caught myself literally sitting down and I'm writing a lecture about this stuff and catching myself having internalized these same ideas. Oh, I love that you all love my dog. And she loves that you all love her. I'm sure she'd love to meet you all. So it's rough, right? And time again, so I'm a tiny creator, right? I have something like 200 followers on Twitter. I have like 350 something people on Twitch, which is a huge number, honestly, more than I ever thought I would have, but in the broad scheme of things is considered fairly small. And there are some hot takes floating around that I barely qualify as a content creator. I don't pay attention to those. But I'm still subject to this. And it's part of why this book appealed to me so much, because I was experiencing a lot of burnout. And even in my small foothold, by just like dipping in the pool of content creator Twitter via VTubing, at least once a week, I see somebody talking about how even if they had low expectations, even if they weren't looking to make money off of this, that the person they have realized that they have slipped into this point where they're exactly where I was at. They feel like they're wasting their time, they're not growing enough, they're burning out and becoming a person that they did not expect to become. And especially when you think about VTubers as a form of content creation, I don't exist outside of the attention economy. If people aren't doing art, if people aren't making art of me, if people aren't listening to me, if people aren't paying attention to my tweets, there is no corporeal body here. I am literally made out of your attention. And so there's kind of a weird relationship there that I guess I didn't think about until now. I don't have a physical body. When I shut off this stream, Ricky stops existing. The person behind her keeps going. But that connection of sort of the VTuber and virtual creators to the attention economy is kind of messed up now that I think about it. There's all that incentive to really exist and to grow and expand because that's literally how you exist. Gotta take a sip of water after that one. Yeah. All right, back on track here. And so we sit at this junction here with even the title of the book being, how do you do nothing? How do you resist the attention economy? Because again, if your attention is so valuable, if your attention is literally a commodity, it may be the most valuable commodity that you have, how can you stand to do nothing? Is that a waste? If I sit down and let's say I take a break and I don't tweet on my VTuber account, or I don't put up videos on YouTube, or I don't stream, sometimes I get anxious. I feel like I'm wasting my time. I'm not growing and I'm not doing enough. And again, it kind of speaks to, even though I can say all this and understand this on an intellectual level, it is hard because these ideas are so permeant in the water that we swim in. It's the air you breathe. It's the water you swim in. You got to do more. You got to hustle. You got to make more things happen. Why aren't you working on your art? Why aren't you working on this? If you are working on your art, why aren't you selling that art? And that's where we live. And there is no escape. You can only consume. You can only create. And you can only attend. And these are the options that you have available to you. And that's it. End. And not quite. Actually, the book is fundamentally hopeful. And this is what I think has really been getting me and was a real pivot for me. When my partner came in and said, "Hey, Ricky, I think you should read this." That first chapter in the introduction really hit me here with this really fundamentally hopeful outlook. So one of the big pieces that comes up and experiences that the author keeps coming back to is visiting the Rose Garden in Oakland, California, of which this is a very nice photo, and exercising what they call deep listening. And that is to say, listening in every possible way to everything possible to hear, no matter what you are doing. And specifically, they draw the distinction between listening and hearing. To hear is an auditory sensation. It's when vibrations hit your eardrum, which are transduced into neurological impulses that are interpreted by your brain. It is something that is just going to have it. Oh gosh, Kara, there's a big chunky hat. I want to visit. It looks beautiful, but now you're telling me that a big chunky cat lives there and will sit in your lap? Oh God, that's beautiful. Anyway, hearing is a physical sensation, but listening is an active process. Attending to information, even if that information is not relevant to a direct task, even if that information is not making anyone any money. And so by doing that, by exercising deep listening, what the author Jenny Odell finds is that this was actually a gateway into doing nothing, doing something, directing her attention in a way that didn't necessarily have to do anything with making money. It didn't have to influence other people. It was actually what I know as mindfulness. So in like my day job as a psychologist, this term gets thrown around a whole lot. And it means a lot of different things. One of my critiques of the mindfulness literature as a psychologist is that the term has been used for so many different things and in so many different ways that it's very hard to pin down what it actually means sometimes. So what do we get? It gets tossed around a lot, but by and large, also thanks again to Wikipedia, mindfulness is a state of active, open attention to the present. This state is described as observing one's thoughts and feelings without judging them as good or bad. This is an extension of deep listening, and if we think about this as sort of a direct opposition to attention economics aim to direct, granularize, quantify, and monetize our attention. And so to be attentive to nothing in particular, to be in a comprehensive state of awareness of the present moment you are in, without having to judge it, without having to evaluate it as, am I going to be making money off of this? Am I going to be able to monetize this later on? Is this getting me to the next step? That is in and of itself an inherently anti-capitalist action. To be mindful is to take that resource, to take your attention, and not make money off of it. Not explicitly. To take the most valuable thing you have and just be present with it. And in doing this, and doing things like deep listening and being aware, a person is able to, at least for a moment, escape the attention economy. Now that I'm saying this out loud, I sometimes wonder if this is the part of the appeal of ASMR content. They have this very intense and very detailed and rich auditory experience that really encourages people to get into a mode of listening over hearing. It's not something people tend to put on in the background. It's something that they attend to, focus on, and are able to really get into the moment with. It's a gateway into a sense of mindfulness. But also, having said that out loud, mindfulness. What was I saying? So like on the talking about being how we're sort of trapped in attention economics, I'm thinking about, interestingly here, it's like the idea of mindfulness. Let's see. And there's an interesting point there, though. Drawing a line between mindfulness exercises and like the shit you do before an improv show to get in the right state of mind. I think that's the point, Samarian. That there's something about a difference in utility. So getting back to the point at hand, I think what's interesting about ASMR is that even though the process of listening can be connected to mindfulness, there is a whole industry built up around the production of ASMR content, around directing attention, and like which is very much situated in content creation and attention economics. So here we are then. We're sitting here talking about deep listening, but there's something particularly different about that. It's one thing to produce that content to try to monetize it and drive ad revenue, but it's something different to maybe go out into the rose garden and listen to birds. Or take a moment before you go to bed or something like that to really just sit and think and feel. These moments of mindfulness don't have a utility to them, and they don't have the aim of making money. So, along with this and being able to attend to and think about information is the process of information overload. So we live in an age where we are constantly inundated with a tremendous deluge of information. But doing nothing is essential to being able to do something. So we've got this idea that came up when I was in high school band. Our director always hammered down this idea of sound and silence. That there is no music without the rest. And yet we exist in this sense of information overload. Not only is there a pressure to always be doing something, but there is always something that you can be attending to. There's a new song, a new movie, a new stream, like a new 3D debut that you need to keep up with if you want to feel like you're in the know. And so when we have this passive deluge of information, doing nothing is an active process. And that's where I really love that distinction between hearing and listening. It's not enough just to walk out into the woods and be like, "Hi, I'm here. I'm doing the thing." There's an active process, a willful effort to do nothing, to direct your attention to nothing in particular. And in doing so, that is where someone is able to find the rest that they need to be able to do something later. Remember, think way back when, like an hour ago, we were talking about how the 40-hour work week was the compromise. All right, I have a very important thing that I need to bring up here. All right, Kara, is it okay if I share this with the stream? I think that everyone needs to see this. All right, I have confirmation that the chonky boy that exists in the Rose Garden is here, and I think everyone needs to see this. So please brace for chonky boy. Let's see if I can. Where is it saved? Is it on my desktop? There it is. Look at this chonky boy! Look at this chonker! This absolute unit! Oh, I love so much. Look at this absolute unit right here. I love it. I love this cat. Oh, that's a good cat. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. Gosh, that's beautiful. All right, back to anti-capitalism. All right, so we're sitting here trapped in this deluge of information where doing nothing must become an active process. It's not enough just to be present, but you have to choose to be present in order to really be able to get the benefits of rest and escaping from the attention economy. If the 40-hour work week was the compromise, the importance of the 8 hours for what you will was exactly this. It was the silence to complement the sound. And if we think about work culture that is rooted in sort of the hustle, where you can always be working, it doesn't really necessarily work out, right? It doesn't map. If you're always trying to work, you're always making noise. And if that was a musical composition, you would just end up with, well, nothing really. You need that silence. You need that rest in order to recoup and be able to be productive later on. So I love this distinction as well from the book. Y'all are familiar with FOMO, right? The fear of missing out. An anxiety that comes from the fear that an interesting event may occur or be happening elsewhere. You gotta watch you gotta have the 4 streams up because you might miss something funny. You gotta watch all the clips. You gotta keep up with people. You gotta be listening to all the music. You gotta watch all the movies. You gotta keep up with the new shows because otherwise you're going to feel like you're not included with something, which leads to this constant consumption of media. But I'm going to introduce you to something that I came across, a new acronym that Jenny Odell drops in the book. Nomo, the necessity of missing out. Yeah, it might be anxiety producing to think that you're going to miss out on something or not going to be included, but that's required. You've got to miss certain things. No one can attend to everything all the time. You have to find time to rest. And in order to do that, to find the silence, in order to be able to complement the sound, you need to accept that you're going to miss out on stuff. And sometimes you need, like, not only are you just going to sort of miss out by happenstance, but you need to choose to miss out. You got to let those apex dailies rock. Maybe sometimes you're not going to be able to roll the character on the gacha. You're not going to catch every stream from your favorite VTuber. And that's fine. In fact, it's a necessity, and it's something that people should be kinder about themselves about. All right. Now, this part isn't in the book, but it's something that I was talking about in Discord, and something that really has been kicking around in my brain. So, I'm old-ish. I am a late 20s, early 30s person. And correspondingly, I listen to a lot of podcasts, one of which is the extremely wonderful Faculty of Horror, which I cannot recommend more highly. Now, there's a thing that came up here, though. The hosts of the Faculty of Horror are older millennials, air quotes, older millennials. So they're in like their mid to late 30s, I believe. I'm in my early 30s, very early 30s. I'm basically 20. And over the course of the last year, during COVID lockdowns, one of the hosts, during a recent episode, started talking about how she started doing Instagram Lives. She's a magazine editor, it's made sense, and so they had a conversation on a recent episode covering the movies Cam and Perfect Blue, where they talked about how it was so weird for them to stream. And there's only a couple years between us, but it was a moment where I really felt a generational difference in how we relate to the attention economy. The idea of being a streamer, of being a content producer, comes more naturally to me than it does to them. And correspondingly, people that are younger than me have a radically different relationship to content and content production. I'm talking about those Zoomers. And so I started thinking about it. And especially around like VTuberdom, Zoomer VTubers that are in their late teens, early 20s are just incredible creators. They've been born in it, molded by it. By the time I was a deer, they were already at thousands of subscribers. And here I am sitting there, even as I'm setting up my stream, realizing that when I'm looking for information about, let's say, how to set up a compressor on my microphone in OBS, I'm watching someone who can't be older than 16 making this tutorial. And that it kind of dawned on me, this person has really never been without the attention economy in social media, whether through their adolescence or even now going into young adulthood. Meanwhile, I do remember a time before Facebook, and I do remember the time before MySpace, before Zanga. It was really in high school that those things kind of kicked off for me. And so when I was reading this book, I was thinking about how this process of mindfulness feels nostalgic to me. It's like getting back to something about being a kid and not having to be so inundated with this idea, this pressure to always be doing something, where I could sit and just watch cartoons or something like that. But more and more, even seeing how survey research is coming back, showing that kids in middle school and high school list content creator or YouTuber or streamer as their ideal job. The relationship between the attention economy and themselves and content creators is just very different. It's like one of the few cases where I've really ever felt old. Maybe the first and hopefully only ever case where I ever feel old. And it's just been kicking around in my brain a lot about how I'm reading this book and I have this particular relationship with sort of the attention economy and this particular understanding of it, but I can't imagine what it might be like if I were to have grown up and that was just what it was like. I think I would have a very different relationship with myself as well. I guess you're right. I think, Aaron, you're right that it's how many of us as kids were listening Pro Athlete or American Idol. singer or something is our dream job. But I think there is something to be said there. I think that particularly to say I want to be a content creator, that seems a little bit, that feels substantively different to me than to say I want to be an athlete, or I want to be a singer, or I want to be a musician. To say I want, and to put it in those words, I want to be a content creator. I don't really have a stable answer there, but it's one thing that does kick around in my brain pretty often. Another piece that's been in my brain, COVID-19. And I feel like COVID-19 isolation and lockdown measures has massively changed the way that people relate to media. I talked before about parasocial relationships and the attention economy and all this kind of stuff. I feel like that is very real for me and how I relate to myself and how I relate to media as well. I mean, obviously, I'm sitting here like presenting myself as a virtual tuber to you. And how many times have you heard someone say over the past year, I think I'm going to start streaming. I think I'm going to start doing content. I'm going to start doing something like that. I'm going to do movie reviews. I'm going to make a podcast. And I'm really curious about how, if we're thinking again about the attention economy and resisting the attention economy, how much would that have changed? And really, what would Jenny Odell really think about the way that people's relationships to media have changed over the course of the last year? I mean, she already wrote about how public spaces have changed in order to optimize and drive people to sort of into the attention economy. Isn't COVID lockdown almost like a super concentrated version of that, of driving people into these situations? Of driving people to attend to watch ads, to check up on shows, to binge watch? I feel like, or even to become producers of that same kind of content. I feel like there's something to be said here. I don't know what the full follow-up will be, but I feel like there's something to be said there. Yeah, and how many people lost their jobs over COVID and had to turn to hustles, to the hustle economy and to hustle culture, and how these same pieces that we're talking about leading into this book and in this book have been exacerbated and accelerated by COVID lockdowns. It's just like a kind of a morsel for thought. I don't have a solid answer. But I think it's something that maybe, a couple years from now, we're going to see some very interesting research coming out about how the lingering effects of COVID on people's relationship to work. But there is there's definitely a silver lining there, when we're starting to see more and more people developing a sense of class consciousness and really valuing their labor and their attention more. And now that's sort of a national news story going on now, isn't it? That people, these sort of minimum wage jobs can't find people to hire back because they recognize that they're worth more than that and their labor is more valuable. We'll see. I'm optimistic. I want to believe that maybe we're going to see something good from that, but you never know. So the last piece I want to close on here is Old Survivor. So what is Old Survivor? Old Survivor is one of 2 old-growth redwood trees that are left in Oakland. All the other ones were cut down by loggers as people advanced west and started setting up sort of the state of California. Logging stripped Oakland, California of its old-growth redwoods, except for one, which is in front of City Hall, and this one. Old Survivor. Sorry, I'm running out of gas here a little bit. It's been a long day at work. So why did Old Survivor survive? Well, it's in a weird and inaccessible location, and also, as you can see from it, it's in a very weird shape. And so when loggers came around and if they found it, 1, it was risky to try to cut it down, and 2, it wasn't necessarily profitable to do so. And that's why Old Survivor exists. It's why that it's sustained itself and been able to exist into the present day. As Jenny puts it, it is a shape that has unable to been appropriated by capitalism. And so it seems like that's really going to be sort of the message going forward, what I'm looking forward to out of this work. How do you become a tree? How can I become a tree? How can I become a shape that cannot be appropriated by capitalism, if even just for a little bit? Or I can produce content without having to worry about who shows up. Or I can take a day off without feeling guilty about it. Yeah, this is what I meant with this when I was becoming a tree. Well, specifically when my girlfriend talks about it, she's been, ever since she read the book, she's been talking about, I'm going to go to walk out into the woods, I'm going to become a tree. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to become a tree, I'm going to become an ent. And then I will become her ent wife. Hmm. Ah. And that's really what I've got here for chapter 1. I'm really looking forward to what's going to be happening going forward in the book. It feels like, looking at the table of contents, the next chapter is the impossibility of retreat, followed by the the anatomy of refusal. So I'm hoping to come back in probably about a week and do something like this again. Just put together, maybe not quite as long of a piece, but breaking down sort of the reading and my reactions to it and chatting about it with people. Actually, there's been a lot of really interesting stuff going on. That's interesting. All right. That's what I got here, so I'm going to trim the video there. But now let's transition into, I guess, just chatting. All right. Give me 1 second. Okay, there we go. All right. Oakland-ish. So my understanding from, that's interesting. So Kara just dropped this in the chat. There's a clothing company in Oakland that uses a redwood tree as their logo, even though all of the redwoods were cut down in Oakland. And it's like, sorry, having Oakland roots, but most of the trees don't. So even the trees, even the redwoods, have become a tool and a symbol of capitalism. And if we're talking about advertising and attention economy, nothing is safe. And this, I think, underscores that importance of making that deliberate point. Because no matter what you do, no matter what you try to do, unless you're making that active effort to really step outside and be present and mindful, your efforts are going to be funneled back into the system and contribute to your own eventual burnout and atomization. It's all about having this sort of deliberate process to be able to step outside of the system, a system that is trying very hard to curtail you back into itself. But that's what it is. That's what it means to become a tree. All right. Well, I'm going to hang out and chat for a while, but like I said, look forward to next week.